Vanessa Parker woke up long before the sun. Her morning routine had become second nature after years of juggling two jobs and raising her 7-year-old son, Ethan, on her own. The faint sound of her alarm cut through the silence of her small apartment, and she instinctively reached for her phone to silence it. She stretched for a moment, trying to shake off the exhaustion that never seemed to leave her body anymore. But there was no time to linger in bed. She had work to do, and more importantly, a little boy to take care of. Sliding out from under the covers, she tiptoed to Ethan's room. He was still sound asleep, his small body curled up under his favorite dinosaur blanket. Vanessa stood in the doorway for a moment, smiling at the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. For all the challenges they faced, Ethan was the light of her life, her reason for pushing through every hardship. She quietly made her way to the kitchen and started preparing his lunch, making sure to include a note, just like she always did. "You're my star, love, Mom." As she packed his lunchbox, she thought about how much Ethan loved school, how he would come home every day, bursting with stories about his classmates, his teacher, and all the new things he was learning. Education was important to Vanessa. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, she had seen what happened to kids who didn't get a good education, who didn't have someone pushing them to succeed. Vanessa had promised herself that Ethan wouldn't go down that path. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes even 3, not just to keep the lights on, but to make sure Ethan never went without. She wanted him to have opportunities, to reach for the stars. But lately, things had been different. Ethan's bright, curious nature seemed to be dimming, and Vanessa couldn't figure out why. She noticed it first when his usual after-school chatter had quieted down. Instead of bounding through the door, full of stories about his day, Ethan had started shuffling in silently, his eyes downcast, dragging his backpack behind him. It wasn't like him at all. She had chalked it up to a bad day at first. Maybe he'd had a disagreement with a friend, or was just tired. But when it continued for days, and then weeks, Vanessa's worry grew. Something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what. As the weeks passed, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that something serious was bothering Ethan. His once lively spirit seemed to have dulled, and the change was becoming more noticeable each day. He no longer leaped out of bed excited to go to school. Instead, mornings had turned into a struggle. "Ethan, time to get up, baby," Vanessa called softly one morning, standing by his bed. He groaned and rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. "You're going to be late, sweetheart," she urged, sitting on the edge of the bed and gently rubbing his back. Ethan sighed deeply but made no effort to move. It wasn't like him at all. Usually, Vanessa couldn't keep him still in the mornings, especially on school days when he was excited to learn and play with his friends. But now, it seemed like school was the last place he wanted to be. "What's wrong, honey?" Vanessa asked, concern filling her voice. Ethan shrugged, his face still hidden in the pillow. "I don't like school anymore," he mumbled, his voice muffled and defeated. Vanessa's heart sank. She hadn't expected that. "You don't like school, you used to love it. Is something going on?" Ethan hesitated, his small shoulders tensing. "It's nothing. I just don't like it." "Is it the work? Are you having trouble with your assignments?" Ethan shook his head. "Is it your friends?" Vanessa asked softly. Again he shook his head. Vanessa frowned, worry gnawing at her. She wasn't going to push him, but the weight of not knowing was heavy. Ethan had always been open with her, always eager to share every detail of his day. Whatever was happening now had made him close up completely, and that frightened her. That evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Vanessa sat on the couch and stared at her phone, debating whether to call his teacher, Miss Dawson. Something was clearly wrong, but she didn't know if it was just a phase or if there was something deeper going on. Finally, she decided to wait. She wanted to talk to Ethan again first, to give him a chance to open up. But the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. 2 weeks later, Vanessa could no longer stand the silence. Ethan's mood hadn't improved, and she was growing more desperate to figure out what was troubling him. His reluctance to go to school, the untouched lunches he brought back every day, and his quiet, withdrawn demeanor were all signs that something was terribly wrong. One Friday, Vanessa decided to take matters into her own hands. She arranged to take her lunch break early and headed to Ethan's school without warning. If she couldn't get answers from him, she would find out for herself. The school was bustling when she arrived, the sounds of children laughing and playing in the courtyard filling the air. Vanessa's heart pounded in her chest as she walked through the front doors and down the hallway toward the cafeteria. As she approached, the sounds of lunch hour grew louder, a familiar chaos of kids chatting and the clatter of trays. But as soon as she stepped inside, her eyes were drawn to a small, heartbreaking scene that stopped her in her tracks. Ethan was sitting alone at a table in the far corner of the room, surrounded by a makeshift cardboard cubicle. The other children laughed and talked nearby, but Ethan was completely cut off, sitting with his head down, his shoulders hunched, as if he was trying to disappear. Vanessa froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of her son isolated in that cardboard prison, away from his classmates, was like a punch to the gut. He looked so small, so alone, and the humiliation on his face was unmistakable. For a moment she couldn't move. Her heart broke into 1,000 pieces as she realized what had been happening. Ethan wasn't just sad he was being singled out, punished in a way that made him feel like an outcast. Rage quickly followed the heartbreak, a surge of anger so strong it nearly knocked her off balance. She marched toward him, her legs trembling as she fought to hold back tears. "Ethan," she called softly as she approached. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise and shame. "Mama," his voice was small, barely a whisper, his lower lip trembling. Vanessa reached out and gently touched his arm. "What is this, baby? Who did this to you?" Before Ethan could answer, a voice came from behind her. "Mrs. Parker, can I help you?" It was Miss Dawson, standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression cool and detached. Vanessa turned to face the teacher, her anger boiling over. "Why is my son sitting in a cardboard box, isolated from his classmates?" she demanded. Miss Dawson didn't flinch. "Ethan has been consistently disruptive in class. This is part of our school's disciplinary procedure. It's meant to help him reflect on his behavior." Vanessa stared at the teacher in disbelief. "Reflect on his behavior. He's 7 years old. You think this is an appropriate way to teach a child?" Miss Dawson raised an eyebrow. "It's a proven method, Mrs. Parker. We've found that it helps students understand the consequences of their actions." Vanessa's hands trembled as she looked back at Ethan, tears welling in her eyes. She knelt down beside him, her voice softening. "Come on, baby. We're going home." As she helped him gather his things, Vanessa's mind raced. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about every child who had ever been made to feel small, who had been punished in a way that broke their spirit. Vanessa knew she couldn't let this go. Miss Dawson had underestimated her, and she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Vanessa's heart pounded as she marched down the hallways of the school, her hand gripping Ethan's small, trembling one. They walked in silence, though a storm of thoughts and emotions swirled inside her. Every time she glanced at her son's downcast eyes and slumped shoulders, her anger flared again. When they reached the principal's office, Vanessa didn't wait for an appointment. She pushed the door open and stood in the doorway, glaring at the man behind the desk. Principal Harper, a tall, graying man in his 50s, looked up from his paperwork with a mild expression of surprise. "Mrs. Parker, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice annoyingly calm. "No, everything is not all right," Vanessa snapped, barely able to keep her voice steady. "I just found my son sitting alone in the cafeteria, surrounded by a cardboard cubicle. Is that what passes for discipline in this school?" Principal Harper's eyebrows rose, but his face remained neutral. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Why don't you sit down, and we can discuss this calmly?" Vanessa shook her head, too furious to sit. "What exactly is there to discuss? My son is being humiliated, separated from his classmates, like he's some kind of criminal?" Before Principal Harper could respond, the door behind them opened, and Miss Dawson stepped into the office, clearly summoned by Harper's secretary. She closed the door quietly and took a seat, her expression devoid of emotion. "Mrs. Parker," Miss Dawson began in a clipped tone, "as I explained to you earlier, Ethan's behavior in class has been consistently disruptive. He talks out of turn, distracts other students, and doesn't follow directions. The isolation is meant to help him focus and reflect on his actions. Vanessa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Has 7 years old. Do you really think isolating him in front of all his peers is going to teach him anything other than shame? Miss Dawson's gaze was cool, dismissive. We've used this method with other students, and it has been effective. Effective at what? Vanessa shot back. Breaking their spirits, making them feel like they don't belong. Principal Harper held up a hand. Mrs. Parker, I understand you're upset, but our disciplinary measures are designed to maintain order in the classroom. If Ethan is having trouble following the rules, it's important that he understands there are consequences. Vanessa stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Consequences? For what? For being a child. You're singling him out, humiliating him in front of his classmates, and you think that's going to help him. Her voice trembled, and she could feel the tears burning at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to stay strong for Ethan. You're punishing my son in a way that's destroying his confidence, she continued, her voice lowering to a fierce whisper. I've seen the way he's changed over the last few weeks. He used to love school. He used to love learning. But now he's afraid. And that's on you. Miss Dawson opened her mouth to respond, but Vanessa wasn't finished. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let this continue, you're wrong. This isn't just about discipline. This is about the emotional and psychological damage you're doing to these kids. Principal Harper looked uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat. Mrs. Parker, if you feel that strongly, you can file a formal complaint. But I assure you, we treat all students the same. No, you don't, Vanessa interrupted, her voice sharp. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what's going on here. With that, she turned, taking Ethan's hand again, and walked out of the office. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. That night, after tucking Ethan into bed, Vanessa sat down beside him. His small face, half hidden beneath his blanket, looked so tired, far too tired for a child his age. She stroked his hair softly, her heart aching. Sweetheart, can we talk? She asked gently. Ethan nodded, though he kept his eyes downcast. I need to know what's been happening at school, Vanessa said softly. I saw what they did to you today, and I want to understand. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? Ethan hesitated, his fingers twisting in the edge of the blanket. I didn't want to make you mad, Mama, he whispered. Oh, baby, Vanessa's voice cracked. I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at them for treating you like this. I need you to tell me everything. Please. Ethan bit his lip, and for a moment, Vanessa thought he wouldn't say anything. But then the words started to tumble out. Miss Dawson, she doesn't like me, he said in a small voice. She always says I talk too much, that I distract everyone. But I don't mean to. I just get excited, and I want to ask questions. Vanessa felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice calm. That's not a bad thing, Ethan. You're allowed to be curious. Ethan shook his head. But Miss Dawson says I'm too loud. And then she makes me sit in the cubicle. I hate it, Mama. I hate sitting in there. Tears welled up in his eyes, and Vanessa's heart shattered. She makes me sit there, and everyone looks at me like I'm a bad kid, Ethan continued, his voice breaking. And then they don't want to play with me at recess. Vanessa swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I didn't want you to be mad at me. I thought maybe I deserved it. Vanessa pulled him into a tight hug, her own tears spilling over. No, baby. You didn't deserve any of that. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. Ethan sniffled into her shoulder, and Vanessa held him close, her heart filled with both love and fury. She had been right to confront the school, but this was bigger than she had imagined. They were hurting her son, breaking his spirit, and she wasn't going to let it happen anymore. I promise you, she whispered into his hair, I'm going to fix this. No one is going to treat you like that again. The next day, Vanessa began reaching out to other parents. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she had a gut feeling that Ethan wasn't the only child being mistreated at the school. And she was right. She started with the moms she saw at drop-off and pickup, casually bringing up the subject of discipline at the school. What she discovered shocked her. Sarah Rodriguez, whose daughter Sophia was in Ethan's class, admitted that her daughter had also been isolated for talking too much. Sophia had come home crying several times, feeling humiliated after being separated from her friends. Then there was Chris Jefferson, a father whose son, Liam, had been frequently punished for hyperactive behavior, even though he had been diagnosed with ADHD. Chris was furious that the school wasn't providing the support Liam needed, instead choosing to isolate and punish him. Before long, Vanessa had gathered a small group of parents who shared similar stories. Their children, often energetic and eager to learn, were being treated as problems rather than kids with unique needs and personalities. The group decided to meet regularly, sharing their experiences and coming up with a plan. They agreed that the school's disciplinary practices were outdated and harmful. Something had to change. "Miss Dawson isn't just strict," Sarah said during one of their meetings. "She's cruel. Our kids are terrified of her." Vanessa nodded in agreement. "And it's not just her. The whole system is broken. We need to push for real change, not just for our kids, but for everyone." Armed with the stories of other parents, Vanessa scheduled another meeting with Principal Harper. This time she brought Sarah and Chris with her, determined to make their voices heard. As they sat in the principal's office, Vanessa couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Harper looked more guarded this time, his expression serious. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Jefferson, Ms. Rodriguez," he greeted them, his tone formal. "I understand you have concerns about our disciplinary practices." Vanessa exchanged a glance with the others before speaking. "It's more than concerns, Principal Harper. The way this school handles discipline is hurting our kids. It's humiliating, it's damaging, and it needs to stop." Harper sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I understand you're upset, but these measures are in place to ensure that all students can learn in a safe and structured environment." "Safe," Chris scoffed. "How is isolating a child in front of their classmates safe? Liam is afraid to go to school because he thinks he's always in trouble." Sarah nodded. "Sophia used to love school. Now she cries every morning because she's afraid of being put in that cubicle again." Harper shifted uncomfortably. "We use these methods sparingly and only when necessary." "Necessary?" Vanessa's voice rose. "Ethan has been put in that cubicle every week for the past month. Is that your idea of sparing?" The tension in the room thickened as Harper avoided their eyes. "Well, look into it," he said finally, but Vanessa wasn't satisfied. "Looking into it isn't enough," she said firmly. "We want action. We want real change. And if you won't do it, well, find someone who will." As the days went on, Vanessa's frustration grew. Despite her efforts, the school's administration remained unyielding. Principal Harper had promised to look into the issue, but nothing seemed to change. Ethan continued to come home from school defeated, and every time she saw that look of sadness in his eyes, Vanessa felt her resolve harden. Ethan was no longer the joyful, curious boy he had once been. He dreaded going to school every day, dragging his feet as she tried to get him out the door in the mornings. His lunchbox came home untouched, his homework assignments half-heartedly completed. Even his teacher's once frequent praise had been replaced with short, condescending notes about his lack of focus and disruptive behavior. Vanessa knew she couldn't wait for the school to change. She had to take matters into her own hands. Vanessa sat in her living room late at night, scrolling through social media. Her mind was racing with everything she had heard from the other parents, stories that mirrored Ethan's struggles. Every time she thought of how helpless he had looked in that cardboard cubicle, her frustration burned brighter. She knew the school wasn't going to make changes unless they were forced to. And the administration's dismissive attitude had made one thing clear: this wasn't just a misunderstanding or an isolated incident, was part of a system that needed to be exposed. That night, with determination coursing through her veins, Vanessa opened her laptop and began typing. 2 days later, the post went viral. Vanessa hadn't expected the overwhelming response to her story. What had started as a heartfelt plea on her personal social media page turned into a movement, as hundreds of parents and educators shared and commented on her post. Parents from other schools, even other districts, began sharing their own stories of children who had been mistreated, isolated, or humiliated under the guise of discipline. The attention snowballed, and soon a local news outlet contacted Vanessa, asking for an interview. Sitting in front of the camera, Vanessa felt nervous but resolute. The reporter, a young woman named Caitlin Mitchell, looked sympathetic as she began the interview. Mrs. Parker, your story has resonated with so many parents across the community. Can you tell us what led you to speak out? Vanessa took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've always believed in the power of education, and I trusted my son's school to nurture him, to help him grow. But what I found instead was a system that isolates and shames children as young as 7 simply for being themselves. My son, Ethan, went from being a bright, curious boy to someone who dreads going to school every day. She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. And he's not the only one. I've spoken to other parents, and their children have experienced the same treatment. Our kids are being humiliated in front of their classmates, made to feel like they don't belong. This isn't discipline, it's emotional abuse. Caitlin nodded, her expression serious. And what are you hoping to achieve with this movement? I want change, Vanessa said, her voice firm. I want the school to stop using these harmful disciplinary methods. I want them to recognize that what they're doing isn't just unfair, it's damaging. And I want parents to know that they have a voice, that they can stand up for their children. By the time the interview aired, Vanessa's story had caught the attention of more news outlets.
Soon other parents were coming forward with similar stories, and the school district found it.
As the media attention grew, Vanessa realized that public pressure alone might not be enough. If the school refused to make changes voluntarily, they needed to be forced into action. It was time to take the fight to the next level. Vanessa reached out to Mark Stone, a lawyer who specialized in education and civil rights cases. Mark had seen cases like this before, and he listened carefully as Vanessa explained what had been happening to Ethan and the other children. We've got a strong case, Mark said, after reviewing the details. The school's disciplinary practices could easily be classified as emotional abuse, especially given the age of the students. And there's a clear pattern of targeting certain kids, mostly those who are more energetic or don't fit into the school's rigid expectations. Vanessa felt a surge of hope. So, what do we do next? We're going to file a formal complaint with the district and demand a full investigation, Mark replied. If they don't respond appropriately, well, escalate. This could end up in court. Vanessa nodded, feeling a new sense of determination. She had been fighting this battle for weeks, and while she had made progress, she knew it wasn't enough. The school needed to be held accountable. The legal process was slow and grueling. Weeks passed as Mark filed motions and sent letters to the district demanding action. In the meantime, Vanessa continued to speak out, rallying more parents to the cause. But with each passing day, the school district dug in its heels, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. They fought back against the claims, and at one point, they even threatened to sue Vanessa and the other parents for defamation. They're trying to intimidate us, Mark said during one of their strategy meetings. But we're not backing down. They can't silence this. Vanessa agreed, but the pressure was immense. The school was stonewalling, and every delay felt like another blow to Ethan, who continued to struggle with the emotional toll of his experience. One day, Vanessa received a call from the school nurse. Her heart raced as she answered, fearing the worst. Mrs. Parker, this is Nurse Williams. Ethan had a bit of a breakdown in class today. He's very upset, and we think it might be best if you come pick him up. Vanessa's stomach dropped. What happened? He started crying in the middle of class, the nurse explained. He couldn't calm down. We've moved him to a quiet room, but he's still very shaken. Vanessa hung up and rushed to the school. When she arrived, she found Ethan sitting in the nurse's office, his face streaked with tears. He looked small and fragile, curled up in one of the chairs with his knees pulled to his chest. Ethan, baby, Vanessa whispered, kneeling in front of him. He looked up at her, his eyes red and puffy. I don't want to go back to class, Mama. I can't do it. Vanessa pulled him into a tight hug, her heart breaking. You don't have to go back, sweetheart. I'm taking you home. As they left the school, Vanessa felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Ethan's breakdown was the result of everything he had been through, weeks of isolation, humiliation, and fear. The school was destroying him, and Vanessa knew she had to fight harder than ever to protect him. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, she vowed to herself that no matter what it took, she would put an end to this. After Ethan's breakdown, Vanessa's resolve hardened. She knew the battle was bigger than her. Now it was about protecting not just Ethan, but every child who had been mistreated by the school's disciplinary system. She started reaching out beyond her immediate circle of parents, connecting with advocacy groups and education reform organizations. One of the first to respond was Jessica Williams, a well-known advocate for educational equity and the founder of a nonprofit focused on ending discriminatory practices in schools. Vanessa met with Jessica over coffee, explaining everything that had been happening at Ethan's school. "This is all too common," Jessica said, shaking her head. "Schools use outdated and harmful methods of discipline, especially on children who don't fit the mold. And it's often kids of color or those with disabilities who are targeted the most." Vanessa nodded. "That's exactly what's happening here. Ethan is just an active, curious kid. Has not a problem. But they've made him feel like he is." Jessica leaned forward. "We can help you. We have legal resources, and we can put more pressure on the district. But more importantly, we can help you organize. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." Vanessa felt a surge of hope. With Jessica's help, they could turn this fight into something much bigger. With Jessica's guidance, Vanessa and the other parents organized a protest outside the school district's headquarters. It started small, just a few dozen parents holding signs and chanting for change. But as the hours passed, more people joined: parents, students, even teachers who were fed up with the district's refusal to address the issue. The protest gained traction on social media, and soon local news outlets were on the scene, broadcasting live from the event. Climax 2. Standing at the front of the crowd, Vanessa felt a mix of nerves and determination. This was her moment, their chance to make sure the district couldn't ignore them anymore. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're here today because our children deserve better," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Our kids are being punished in ways that hurt them, that make them feel like they don't belong. And we're not going to stand by and let it happen anymore." The crowd cheered, and Vanessa felt a surge of energy. She continued, pouring her heart into every word. "We demand change. We demand accountability. And we won't stop until every child in this district is treated with respect, with kindness, and with the dignity they deserve." The protest stretched into the afternoon, and by the end of the day, the district had no choice but to respond. They announced that they would open an investigation into the school's disciplinary practices. It wasn't everything Vanessa had hoped for, but it was a start. The district's announcement of an independent investigation brought a sense of cautious optimism to Vanessa and the other parents. Finally, after weeks of fighting, they were starting to see real progress. But Vanessa knew better than to relax. The investigation, led by an outside consulting firm, promised a thorough review of the school's disciplinary methods. But as the process dragged on, it became clear that the district wasn't in any hurry to make changes. Meetings were delayed, reports were pushed back, and the administration remained frustratingly vague about their timeline. Vanessa's patience wore thin. She had come too far to let the district brush this under the rug. One evening, as she sat with Mark Stone in his office, she voiced her concerns. "They're stalling," she said, her frustration evident. "They're trying to wait us out." Mark nodded. "That's a common tactic. They hope you'll lose momentum, that people will stop paying attention." Vanessa shook her head. "That's not going to happen. We're not going away." Mark smiled. "Good. Because we've got another card to play." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mark leaned forward. "We're going to file a class action lawsuit. This isn't just about Ethan anymore. It's about every child who's been mistreated by the school, and we're going to hold them accountable." Vanessa had been hopeful when the district announced the investigation. It felt like a victory finally. Someone was taking the situation seriously. But as the days turned into weeks, her optimism began to fade. The district's responses became more vague, meetings were repeatedly postponed, and any updates on the investigation were minimal at best. At first, Vanessa tried to remain patient. She kept in contact with Mark Stone, who reassured her that these things took time. But each delay felt like another slap in the face. And worse, while they waited, Ethan was still suffering. The isolation had stopped, but the damage was already done. Ethan's confidence remained shattered, and his anxiety about school persisted. Vanessa wasn't alone in her frustration. Sarah Rodriguez, Chris Jefferson, and the other parents in the group were growing increasingly angry. They held meetings in Vanessa's living room, exchanging updates and discussing their next moves. The longer the district dragged its feet, the more the group began to splinter. Some parents, worn down by the endless waiting, started to lose hope. "This isn't going anywhere," Chris said one evening, his voice edged with frustration. "They're stringing us along. They don't care. They're hoping we'll give up," Vanessa said, her voice tight with anger. "And that's exactly why we can't." "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Sarah admitted, looking exhausted. "Sophia's doing better now, and I don't want to drag her through this anymore." The tension in the room was palpable. Vanessa understood their frustration. It felt like they were stuck in a never-ending battle, and the strain was starting to take its toll on everyone. But Vanessa couldn't back down. She had come too far, and Ethan's struggles were still raw and ever-present in her mind. "I get it," Vanessa said, looking around at the group. "This is hard. But if we give up now, everything we've done so far will be for nothing. The district wants us to quit. They're waiting for it. But I'm not going to let them win." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was silent. Slowly the other parents nodded in agreement, though their resolve seemed more fragile than before. Vanessa knew she couldn't let their momentum falter, but the weight of the fight was becoming heavier by the day. Ethan's emotional recovery was slow, and every setback broke Vanessa's heart a little more. He was still going to school, but he no longer enjoyed it. The boy who used to wake up eager to learn now dragged his feet every morning, his once bright eyes dulled by the weight of his fear and anxiety. At night, Vanessa would find Ethan sitting silently in his room, staring at his homework without touching it. She sat beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked softly. Ethan shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "I don't know, Mama. I just don't want to go to school anymore." Vanessa's heart clenched. "I know it's been hard, baby, but I promise things are going to get better." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "What if they don't?" Vanessa swallowed the lump in her throat. She didn't know how to answer that. What if they didn't get better? She had been fighting so hard, but every day it felt like the system was working against them. And all the while, Ethan was the one paying the price. "Things will get better," Vanessa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not going to stop fighting for you. We're going to fix this, okay?" Ethan nodded, but Vanessa could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. She kissed his forehead and pulled him into a hug, silently vowing to do whatever it took to restore his confidence. The days blurred together in a haze of frustration and exhaustion. Vanessa was burning the candle at both ends, working 2 jobs, attending school meetings, coordinating with Mark on the legal case, and taking care of Ethan. The stress weighed on her like a physical burden, and it felt like no matter how hard she fought, nothing was moving forward. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, Vanessa sat down at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. The weight of everything suddenly felt unbearable. She had been fighting for so long, months of pushing, organizing, advocating, and she was running on empty. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stared at the pile of documents in front of her legal papers, emails from the school district, and notes from her meetings with other parents. It all felt like too much. The investigation was dragging on, and every step forward seemed to come with another setback. Vanessa felt like she was failing Ethan, failing the other parents, failing herself. Her mind raced with thoughts of doubt. What if they never got justice? What if Ethan never recovered from this? What if, despite everything, nothing changed? In that moment, sitting alone in her quiet apartment, Vanessa felt utterly defeated. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly into the silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. She had been holding it together for so long, putting on a brave face for Ethan and the other parents. But now, in the quiet darkness of her kitchen, she couldn't hold it in any longer. After what felt like hours, Vanessa finally lifted her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her heart still ached, but the tears had brought a sense of clarity. She couldn't give up, not now, not ever. If she stopped fighting, the school district would win. And more importantly, Ethan would lose. Vanessa took a deep breath and straightened up. There was no other option. She had to keep going for Ethan's sake and for every child who had been mistreated. A few weeks later, after what seemed like endless waiting, Vanessa got the call she had been hoping for. "We have a decision," Mark Stone said over the phone, his voice calm but serious. "The district's investigation is complete, and the findings are in our favor." Vanessa's heart raced. What did they say? They found evidence of discriminatory disciplinary practices, specifically targeting students with higher energy levels, students of color, and those with learning differences. Miss Dawson's conduct has been deemed inappropriate, and the district is implementing immediate changes. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. "They're actually changing the policies." "Yes," Mark replied. "The isolation cubicles are being removed, and the district will implement restorative justice practices instead. There's also going to be mandatory training for teachers on cultural competency and how to handle diverse learning needs." A wave of relief washed over Vanessa, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could finally breathe again. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a huge step forward. "What about Miss Dawson?" Vanessa asked. "She's being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation," Mark said. "There's still more to be done, but this is a big win." Vanessa thanked Mark and hung up the phone, tears welling up in her eyes. After months of fighting, they had finally made progress. The school was going to change because of her, because of Ethan, because of all the parents who had refused to back down. That evening, when Ethan came home from school, Vanessa sat him down and told him the news. "They're changing things at school, Ethan," she said, smiling through her tears. "They're getting rid of the cubicles, and they're going to make sure no one is treated the way you were." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Really? Really, baby?" Vanessa said, pulling him into a tight hug. "We did it." Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. Vanessa held him close, her heart swelling with pride. They had fought a long, hard battle, and it wasn't over yet. But for the first time, they had hope. In the weeks that followed, the changes at the school became more apparent. The district rolled out its new policies, and the isolating cubicles were removed from classrooms. Teachers began undergoing training on how to handle students with diverse learning styles, and a renewed focus on inclusivity and respect spread throughout the school. Ethan slowly started to come back to life. It wasn't an overnight change, he still struggled with anxiety. And there were days when school felt like a burden, but the dark cloud that had been hanging over him began to lift. Vanessa could see the difference in his demeanor. He smiled more, played outside again, and even started talking about his friends at school. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Ethan looked up at his mom with a small smile. "Mama, school's getting better," he said softly. Vanessa's heart swelled. "I'm glad, baby. I'm so proud of you." Ethan grinned. "I'm proud of you too, Mama. You're my hero." Tears filled Vanessa's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She had fought for her son, for every child in that school, and they had won. The changes at the school were significant, but for Vanessa, it wasn't just about new policies, it was about accountability. She needed the school to admit the harm they had caused, to acknowledge the pain that Ethan and so many other children had endured. And finally, that day came. Vanessa sat in the auditorium of Lincoln Elementary, alongside other parents who had been fighting for the same justice. The school had organized a public meeting, inviting parents, teachers, and community members to hear the results of the district's investigation and the steps they were taking to rectify the situation. Principal Harper stood at the podium, looking more worn and humble than Vanessa had ever seen him. His usual authoritative presence had softened, replaced by what seemed to be genuine remorse. We're here today to address the concerns that many of you have raised over the past months, he began, his voice steady but subdued. We've listened to you, and we've seen the impact of our actions. We realize now that our disciplinary methods were not only ineffective, but harmful to our students. For that, I want to personally apologize to all the children and families who were affected. Vanessa's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. She wasn't sure if an apology would ever come, but hearing those words felt like a validation of everything they had fought for. Principal Harper continued, his gaze sweeping the room. We've learned from this experience, and we're committed to making sure that no child in our school ever feels isolated, humiliated, or unworthy again. We're implementing restorative justice practices, increasing teacher training, and working closely with parents to ensure that every student is treated with respect and dignity. The room was silent for a moment as his words sank in. Vanessa looked around at the other parents, some of whom had tears in their eyes. She squeezed Ethan's hand, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a lingering sadness for what her son had been through. But most of all, she felt a sense of closure. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about making sure that this never happened to another child again. And now, it felt like they were finally on the path toward real, meaningful change. A few months later, the atmosphere at Lincoln Elementary had shifted dramatically. The once cold, sterile environment had been transformed into a place of warmth and inclusivity. The cubicles were gone, replaced by collaborative learning spaces where children could interact and support each other. Teachers had undergone extensive training in how to work with students who had diverse learning needs. They were encouraged to use positive reinforcement rather than punitive measures, and the entire school had adopted a philosophy of restorative justice, where conflicts were resolved through dialogue and understanding rather than punishment. For Ethan, the change had been slow but steady. He was still healing from the emotional scars of the past year, but the improvement was undeniable. His anxiety about school had lessened, and he was beginning to regain the confidence he had lost. One afternoon, Vanessa sat in the school courtyard, watching Ethan play with his friends. His laughter rang through the air as he chased after a soccer ball, his face bright with joy. It was a sight that Vanessa hadn't seen in what felt like a long time, and it filled her with hope. "Looks like things are finally turning around," said a voice beside her. Vanessa turned to see Sarah Rodriguez, smiling as she watched her own daughter, Sophia, playing nearby. "They are," Vanessa agreed, smiling back. "It's taken time, but I think we're finally seeing the results of everything we fought for." Sarah nodded. "I'm glad we stuck it out. There were times when I wasn't sure we'd make it." Vanessa sighed, the weight of the past month still fresh in her mind. "There were times I wanted to quit too, but I couldn't. Not for Ethan." Sarah glanced at her, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you were the one who kept us going. Without you, I don't think we would have gotten this far." Vanessa shook her head modestly. "It wasn't just me. We all did this together." Sarah smiled, but there was no denying the truth in her words. Vanessa had been the driving force behind their movement, the one who had refused to back down, even when the fight seemed impossible. And now, because of her, their children were finally getting the education and care they deserved. A few weeks later, Vanessa received a letter in the mail from the school district. The letter was an invitation, asking her to speak at a district-wide conference on education reform. The district wanted her to share her experience and the journey that had led to the changes at Lincoln Elementary. Vanessa was both honored and nervous. She had never seen herself as a public speaker. She was just a mother who had fought for her child. But she also knew how important it was to continue sharing their story, to inspire other parents and educators to stand up for what was right. When the day of the conference arrived, Vanessa stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces. Teachers, administrators, and parents from across the district were gathered to hear her speak. She took a deep breath and began. "When I started this journey, I was just a mom trying to protect her son," Vanessa said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Ethan was being punished for simply being who he was, an active, curious little boy. And the methods that were being used against him weren't helping him learn. They were hurting him. She paused, gathering her thoughts as the room listened in silence. But I wasn't alone. Other parents were going through the same thing. And together we realized that we had the power to demand change. We refused to accept that this was how things had to be. Vanessa looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with pride. We stood up for our children. We fought for their right to be treated with respect, to be valued for who they are. And because of that fight, things are changing. Our kids are happier, they're thriving, and they're excited about learning again. As she finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. Vanessa smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. She had fought for her son, but in doing so, she had also helped change the system for so many other children. The changes at Lincoln Elementary didn't just stop at the school. Word of the reforms began to spread, and other schools in the district started adopting similar practices. The district's move toward restorative justice and inclusive education became a model for schools across the region. Vanessa's story was featured in local newspapers, and soon after, a national education magazine picked it up. Her fight for Ethan's well-being had sparked a movement that was now inspiring parents and educators across the country. Vanessa never set out to be an advocate, but as more people reached out to her, seeking advice and guidance, she realized how much impact her voice could have. She began speaking at other conferences, sharing the lessons she had learned, and encouraging parents to fight for their children's rights. It only takes one person, Vanessa would say in her speeches. One person to say, enough. One person to stand up and refuse to accept injustice. And when we come together, that's when real change happens. As the months passed, Vanessa watched with joy as Ethan's confidence grew. He was no longer the anxious, withdrawn boy who dreaded going to school. He had rediscovered his love for learning, and his excitement for life had returned. One evening, as Vanessa was preparing dinner, Ethan came into the kitchen with a huge grin on his face. "Mama, guess what he said, bouncing on his toes. I got an award today." Vanessa turned around, smiling at his enthusiasm. "An award for what?" "For being a good friend," Ethan exclaimed, holding up a certificate. "Miss Carter said I always help other kids and make them feel happy." Vanessa's heart swelled with pride. She knelt down and pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him close. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're such a good boy. You've always been." Ethan beamed up at her, and in that moment, Vanessa felt like everything they had been through, the struggles, the pain, the fight had been worth it. As the school year drew to a close, Vanessa reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a personal fight for her son had transformed into something much bigger, a movement that had changed the lives of countless children and families. Vanessa knew there was still work to be done. There were other schools, other districts, where children were facing the same struggles that Ethan had. But she was no longer afraid of the fight. She had found her voice, and she knew that she could make a difference. On the last day of school, Vanessa and Ethan stood in front of a mural that had been painted by the students and teachers. It depicted children of all backgrounds, hand in hand, under a bright rainbow. Across the top, the words "Every Child Matters" were written in bold, colorful letters. "We helped paint that," Ethan said proudly, pointing to the mural. "It's to remind everyone that we're all special, even if we're different." Vanessa felt a lump in her throat as she looked at the mural. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, a reminder that every child deserved to feel valued and respected. As they walked away, Vanessa smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. They had started a revolution, and that revolution would continue to ripple outward, touching the lives of children everywhere. And it had all begun with one mother's fight for her son. The following school year began with a noticeable shift in Ethan's demeanor. Vanessa watched with pride as her son woke up each morning with excitement in his eyes. Gone were the days when she had to coax him out of bed, battling his reluctance and fear. Now, Ethan was eager to start each day, ready to face new challenges and explore the world around him. One crisp autumn morning, as Vanessa packed Ethan's lunch, he came into the kitchen, his backpack already slung over his shoulder. He sat down at the table, swinging his legs back and forth as he spoke. "Mama, we're starting a new science project today," Ethan exclaimed, his eyes sparkling. Miss Carter said we get to build our own volcanoes. Vanessa smiled, her heart swelling with joy. It had been months since the turmoil with the school, but Ethan's transformation still filled her with awe. He had come so far from the scared, withdrawn boy he had once been. Now he was thriving, eager to learn, eager to participate, eager to be himself. That sounds amazing, sweetheart, Vanessa said, handing him his lunch. I can't wait to see your volcano. Ethan grinned, his face lighting up. I'm going to make it explode with baking soda and vinegar, Miss Carter said. I'm really good at science. As they walked to the school together, Vanessa reflected on how much had changed. The school's new policies had created an environment where Ethan could flourish, and Vanessa knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. He had found his confidence again, and more importantly, he had found his love for learning. A few months later, Vanessa stood backstage at the National Education Reform Conference, her heart pounding in her chest. The auditorium was filled with teachers, administrators, policymakers, and parents from all over the country. The energy in the room was electric, and Vanessa could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This was her chance to make a difference, not just for Ethan, but for every child who had been hurt by a broken system. When her name was called, Vanessa stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. She walked to the podium, her hands gripping the edges as she looked out at the sea of faces before her. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. But then she thought of Ethan, and the courage he had shown in facing his fears. If he could do it, so could she. My name is Vanessa Parker, she began, her voice clear and strong. I'm a mother, an advocate, and a fighter. But most of all, I'm someone who refused to let the system break my child. The room was silent as Vanessa spoke, sharing the story of Ethan's isolation, his anxiety, and the fight that had brought about change at Lincoln Elementary. She talked about the power of a mother's love, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the responsibility that educators had to nurture, not punish, the children in their care. As she spoke, she could feel the audience hanging on her every word, their expressions filled with empathy and understanding. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Vanessa stepped back from the podium, her heart racing. She had done it. She had shared her story, and now it was up to the world to take that story and use it to create change. In the months that followed the conference, Vanessa's influence continued to grow. Schools across the country began to adopt the restorative justice practices that had been implemented at Lincoln Elementary. Teachers were trained to recognize the emotional needs of their students, and punitive measures were replaced with more compassionate approaches to discipline. Vanessa became a full-time advocate, working with school districts, parent groups, and lawmakers to push for national reforms in education. She traveled to different states, speaking at town halls, schools, and community centers, sharing her story and empowering others to take action. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to thrive. He excelled in his classes, made new friends, and grew into a confident, kind-hearted young boy. Every day, Vanessa watched him with pride, knowing that their fight had not only changed his life, but had also paved the way for a brighter future for so many other children. One day, as Vanessa and Ethan walked home from school, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Mama, do you think other kids will have to fight like we did?" he asked. Vanessa smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "I hope not, sweetheart. That's why we did what we did, so that other kids don't have to go through what you went through." Ethan nodded, his face serious. "I want to help other kids too, Mama. I want them to know that it's okay to be different." Vanessa felt a lump in her throat as she looked at her son, so wise beyond his years. "You already are helping, Ethan. By being yourself, you're showing other kids that they can be themselves too." Years later, as Vanessa reflected on everything they had been through, she realized that their fight had become more than just a personal battle. It had become a movement for justice, for compassion, and for the belief that every child, no matter their background or abilities, deserved to be treated with respect. Ethan had grown into a bright, empathetic young man, and Vanessa couldn't have been prouder of him. He had faced challenges that no child should have to face, but he had come out of it stronger, more resilient, and more determined to make a difference in the world. And Vanessa, once an ordinary mother just trying to protect her son, had found her purpose. She had discovered the power of her voice and the strength that came from standing up for what was right. As she sat in her home, surrounded by pictures of Ethan's school days and the countless awards and letters of appreciation she had received over the years, Vanessa knew that their story was far from over. There would always be more battles to fight, more children to protect, more systems to change. But she also knew that they had made a lasting impact. They had changed not just one school, but an entire community. And their story would continue to inspire others for generations to come. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Back home, Vanessa continued her work on the ground, collaborating with local parent groups and educators to implement the changes she had fought for. She helped organize workshops for teachers on restorative justice practices and built connections with local leaders to ensure that school reforms were being upheld. One of the most rewarding parts of Vanessa's journey was seeing the difference it made for children who had once felt like outcasts. She was approached by a mother at one of her workshops, Karen Davis, who shared a familiar story. "My son Tyler was going through the same thing as Ethan," Karen explained, her voice emotional. "He's been singled out for his ADHD, and they kept punishing him for things he can't control. I didn't know what to do, but after hearing your story, I realized I could fight for him too. Now, things are better for him at school. Thank you for giving us the courage to speak up." Vanessa's heart swelled with emotion. Hearing these stories reminded her that every step of her journey had been worth it. She wasn't just changing policies, she was changing lives. And with every new success, she felt more determined to continue the work. Vanessa also began reaching out to school administrators, including Principal Harper. Their relationship had been strained during the initial fight, but in the months since the reforms had been implemented, Harper had undergone a transformation of his own. He now actively participated in the new training programs and was a key figure in promoting restorative justice practices within the school. During one of their meetings, Harper approached Vanessa with a thoughtful expression. "I've learned a lot over the past year," he admitted. "At first I was resistant to the changes, but seeing the impact it's had on the students, I can't deny it's been for the better. I'm sorry for the way things were handled with Ethan." Vanessa accepted his apology, grateful that they could move forward. "It's not about blame anymore," she said. "It's about making sure no child feels like they don't belong. We're all learning together." As the years passed, Ethan continued to grow and flourish in the newly transformed school environment. He excelled academically, but more importantly, he thrived emotionally and socially. His teachers praised his leadership and empathy, noting how he often went out of his way to help classmates who were struggling. Vanessa watched with pride as Ethan became more confident and self-assured. His experience of being isolated and mistreated had shaped him into a compassionate young man who was determined to stand up for others. One afternoon, Vanessa received a call from Ethan's teacher, Miss Carter, who had been instrumental in his recovery. "Mrs. Parker, I just wanted to let you know that Ethan has been selected for a special leadership program," Miss Carter said. "He's shown such incredible growth and maturity, and we think he would be a great mentor for younger students who are struggling." Vanessa smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "That's wonderful news. I'm so proud of him." The leadership program was designed to pair older students with younger children who were facing similar challenges. Ethan, having experienced the pain of isolation, was eager to help others avoid the same fate. He became a mentor to a shy first grader named Daniel, who had trouble adjusting to school life. Over time, Vanessa watched as Ethan helped Daniel come out of his shell, encouraging him to participate in class and make new friends. It was a full-circle moment for Vanessa, who saw in Daniel the same struggles that Ethan had once faced. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Ethan spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Mama, I think I want to be a teacher when I grow up," he said, his eyes bright with determination. "I want to help kids like Daniel. I want them to know that they're not alone." Vanessa's heart swelled with pride. "You'd make an amazing teacher, Ethan." She knew that Ethan's experiences had shaped him in ways that would last a lifetime. He had faced adversity and come out stronger, more compassionate, and ready to make a difference in the world. Vanessa's advocacy work began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a personal fight for Ethan had evolved into a nationwide movement for educational reform. Parent groups across the country adopted the frameworks she had helped establish, and Vanessa's influence reached even farther than she had ever imagined. One day, she was approached by an education nonprofit that wanted to partner with her to launch a new initiative, Every Child Matters, a program aimed at providing resources and support for parents, teachers, and students affected by harmful disciplinary practices. The organization offered Vanessa a leadership role in the initiative, allowing her to expand her work on a much larger scale. Vanessa accepted the offer, knowing that this was the next step in her journey. She would be able to help families across the country navigate the same struggles she had faced, and ensure that no child was left behind in an education system that too often overlooked their needs. The launch of Every Child Matters was a major success, and the program quickly gained national recognition. Vanessa traveled to different states, speaking to school boards, attending community meetings, and advocating for legislative changes to protect children from punitive discipline. Through it all, Vanessa remained grounded in her mission to fight for children like Ethan, to ensure they had a voice, and to create a world where every child could thrive in an environment that nurtured their strengths. Years passed, and Vanessa's work became a cornerstone of the national education reform movement. Her story was featured in documentaries, news articles, and education forums. But no matter how much recognition she received, Vanessa remained focused on the children who were at the heart of her fight. Ethan grew into a confident young adult, excelling in his studies and continuing his advocacy work alongside his mother. He went on to pursue a degree in education, determined to become the kind of teacher who would never let a child feel the way he once had. On the day of Ethan's high school graduation, Vanessa sat in the audience, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son walk across the stage. The journey they had been on, the challenges, the heartbreak, the triumphs, had all led to this moment. As Ethan accepted his diploma, he looked out into the crowd and found his mother's eyes. He smiled, and Vanessa knew that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Vanessa's fight had become more than just a battle for her son's well-being. It had become a legacy, a movement that would continue to ripple through schools, communities, and families for generations to come. As they walked out of the ceremony together, Ethan turned to Vanessa, his voice filled with gratitude. "Mama, you changed everything," he said softly. "For me, for everyone." Vanessa smiled, her heart full of pride and love. "We did it together, Ethan, and we're not done yet." With that, they stepped into the future, ready to continue their fight hand in hand. With Every Child Matters gaining momentum nationwide, Vanessa's work was far from done. As her influence grew, so did the number of communities that wanted to adopt the reform model she had championed. Schools in cities and rural towns alike began reaching out, asking for help in transforming their outdated disciplinary systems. Vanessa, now a full-time advocate and director of the initiative, found herself traveling more than ever. She visited schools across the country, from urban districts struggling with overcrowding to small rural schools where resources were scarce. In each place, Vanessa shared her story and offered the support necessary to create lasting change. One of her visits took her to Robinson Middle School, a struggling institution in a small rural town. The school's principal, Ms. Clara Richardson, had reached out after hearing about the success of Lincoln Elementary's reforms. "Vanessa, we've been trying to implement new policies, but it's hard, Ms." Richardson admitted during their first meeting. "The teachers are used to doing things the old way, and they're resistant to change. We need your help to show them a better way." Vanessa could see the challenges ahead, but also the potential for transformation. She knew that schools like Robinson were the most in need of support, and that the change would only come if the entire community came together. Over the next few months, Vanessa worked closely with the school staff, conducting workshops and providing resources. She met with parents, many of whom had felt powerless to speak up for their children. Together, they built a support system that would hold the school accountable and create a nurturing environment for students. Slowly but surely, the changes took root. Teachers began using restorative justice practices, and the students, once disengaged and fearful of punishment, became more involved in their learning. By the end of the year, Robinson Middle School had become a model for other schools in the region. Ms. Richardson thanked Vanessa tearfully at the year's final meeting. "You've shown us what's possible when we believe in our students and work together. We couldn't have done this without you." Vanessa smiled. "You did it. I was just here to show you how." Vanessa had learned early in her journey that one voice could make a difference, but many voices together could create a movement. She began to focus on bringing parents, teachers, and communities together to build networks of support across the country. She knew that the key to sustaining change wasn't just in implementing new policies, but in creating a community of advocates who could carry the work forward. Through Every Child Matters, Vanessa organized a series of conferences where parents, educators, and activists could come together to share their stories, learn from one another, and build coalitions. These gatherings became a powerful force for change, spreading the message of inclusive, compassionate education far and wide. At one of these conferences, Vanessa met Tanya Bennett, a single mother from Chicago who had faced similar struggles with her son Jordan, who had been unfairly punished at school for acting out due to his undiagnosed ADHD. Tanya's story echoed Vanessa's own, and the two women quickly bonded over their shared experiences. "I didn't know I had the power to fight back," Tanya said, her voice full of emotion. "But hearing your story, Vanessa, gave me the courage to speak up for Jordan. Now he's getting the help he needs, and I'm not going to stop fighting until every child gets the support they deserve." Vanessa hugged Tanya, moved by her strength and determination. "That's exactly why we're doing this," she said. "You're not alone in this fight. None of us are." The conferences continued to grow, attracting thousands of participants from all walks of life. Vanessa saw firsthand the power of community, how parents, teachers, and students could come together to create lasting change. They shared strategies, offered encouragement, and built networks that spanned the country. Together, they were unstoppable. With the widespread success of Every Child Matters and the growing public demand for change, policymakers began to take notice. Vanessa had been in and out of meetings with education officials, advocating for the national implementation of restorative justice practices and mental health support for students. But now, the conversations were turning into something more tangible, a potential education reform bill that could change the way schools across the nation approach discipline. One afternoon, Vanessa received a phone call from Senator Thomas Miller, who had become a key ally in her efforts. "Vanessa, I wanted to let you know that we're moving forward with the bill," Senator Miller said. "It's called the Every Child Deserves a Chance Act, and it's based heavily on the work you've been doing. We want to make sure that no child is left behind because of an outdated disciplinary system." Vanessa was speechless for a moment, her heart racing. "A national bill? This is incredible." Senator Miller chuckled. "It's long overdue, but we need your help to rally support. The bill will face opposition from those who believe in tough discipline. So we need the voices of parents, teachers, and advocates like you to push this through." Vanessa didn't hesitate. She knew this was the opportunity they had been working toward, a chance to change the system on a national level. Over the next few months, she threw herself into the campaign, speaking at rallies, organizing petitions, and meeting with lawmakers to build support for the bill. The journey was difficult, filled with opposition from those who believed the old ways were the only ways, but Vanessa's persistence paid off. The voices of parents, educators, and students from across the country began to sway the conversation. And finally, after months of campaigning, the Every Child Deserves a Chance Act was passed in Congress. Vanessa stood on the steps of the Capitol building, surrounded by the parents and advocates who had fought alongside her. As she watched the bill become law, tears of joy filled her eyes. It was a monumental victory, not just for her, but for every child in the country. Ethan had watched his mother's work with pride over the years. He had grown up seeing her fight for justice, not just for him, but for children everywhere. Now, as he prepared to graduate high school, Ethan was more determined than ever to follow in her footsteps. During his senior year, Ethan had become a mentor for younger students, just as he had once been for Daniel. He helped students who were struggling, offering guidance and support as they navigated the challenges of school life. His empathy and leadership had made him a role model, and his teachers often praised him for his dedication to making the school a better place. But Ethan's ambitions didn't stop there. One evening, as Vanessa was preparing dinner, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table, his face serious. "Mama, I've been thinking a lot about my future," he began, glancing at her nervously. Vanessa turned to him, smiling warmly. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" "I want to go into education," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I want to become a teacher, but not just any teacher. I want to work with kids who are struggling, kids who need someone to believe in them, the way you believed in me." Vanessa's heart swelled with pride, tears welling up in her eyes. "Ethan, that's incredible. You're going to change so many lives." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with determination. "I just want to make sure that no kid ever feels the way I did back then. I want to be the kind of teacher who helps them see their potential." As Ethan prepared for college, Vanessa knew that his future was bright. He had inherited her passion for justice, and she was certain that he would carry the torch forward, continuing the work they had started together. Years passed, and the work Vanessa had begun with Every Child Matters continued to expand. Schools across the country had embraced the reforms, and the national education system had undergone a transformation. Restorative justice practices became the standard, and punitive exclusionary discipline was being phased out. Vanessa's legacy was not only in the laws that had been passed or the policies that had been changed. It was in the lives of the children who had been given a second chance. Children who had once been isolated, punished, or silenced were now thriving in environments that nurtured their strengths and supported their emotional well-being. One day, Vanessa returned to Lincoln Elementary, the place where it had all begun. The school had changed so much since her battle there, and it now stood as a shining example of what a compassionate, inclusive education system could look like. As she walked through the hallways, she passed by a mural that the students had painted, a vibrant display of diversity, with children of all backgrounds holding hands beneath a banner that read, "Every Child Matters." Vanessa smiled, tears filling her eyes as she looked at the mural. This was what she had fought for. This was the future she had dreamed of. Standing in front of the mural, Vanessa felt a deep sense of peace. She had started this journey as a mother fighting for her son, but along the way, she had found her purpose. She had become an advocate, a leader, and a force for change. And as she looked around at the thriving, joyful children in the school, Vanessa knew that her legacy would live on, not just in the policies she had helped change, but in the hearts of the children who now had the chance to grow, learn, and shine. The day had finally come. Ethan was about to begin his career as a teacher. After years of studying education and working with various programs that focused on helping students with diverse learning needs, he was ready to take his place at the front of the classroom. Vanessa couldn't have been prouder as she helped him get ready for his first day. She watched as he packed his bag with lesson plans, markers, and notebooks, his face a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. "You're going to be amazing, Ethan," Vanessa said, smiling as she handed him a thermos of coffee. "Just remember, you're not just teaching them subjects, you're helping them see their worth." Ethan nodded, his eyes serious but determined. "I know, Mama. I've been thinking about this for years, and I want to make sure every student in my class knows they matter." That afternoon, as Ethan stood in front of his first group of students, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He introduced himself, smiling warmly at the young faces, looking up at him with curiosity. "Mr. Parker," he began, "and I'm here to help you learn, but more importantly, I'm here to help you see how incredible you are. In this classroom, every one of you matters, and we're going to learn together, support each other, and grow as a team." The students smiled back, and Ethan could feel the excitement building in the room. This was what he had always wanted, to create a space where every child could thrive. As the weeks went on, Ethan quickly became a favorite teacher among his students. He used the same restorative justice principles that had transformed his own school experience, focusing on building relationships and understanding each student's individual needs. He created a classroom environment where everyone felt safe to express themselves, ask questions, and take risks. One day, after a particularly challenging class, Ethan sat at his desk, reflecting on how far he had come. He pulled out a photograph of him and Vanessa from his high school graduation and smiled. Everything he had learned, everything he had fought for, had led him to this moment. Ethan knew that the journey wasn't always easy, but he was ready. He had his mother's strength, her determination, and her unwavering belief that every child deserved a chance. And now it was his turn to pass that message on. While Ethan was busy shaping the minds of his students, Vanessa continued her work with Every Child Matters. But she began to feel that her next challenge was on the horizon. Her advocacy work had taken her all over the country, but she wanted to ensure that the changes she had fought for were sustained for future generations. One evening, while she was reviewing the latest reports from various school districts, Vanessa received a call from an unexpected source. It was Governor Allison Moore, a progressive leader who had been following Vanessa's work closely. "Vanessa, I've been meaning to talk to you for a while," the governor began. "Your work with education reform has been incredible, and we're seeing real results because of it. But I think you're capable of even more." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I'm running for re-election next year, and I want to expand my platform to focus more on educational equity and reform," Governor Moore explained. "I'd like you to join my team as a special advisor. With your experience and passion, we could make even bigger strides, not just in schools, but at the state level." Vanessa was taken aback. She had never imagined herself working in politics, but the idea of influencing education policy on a broader scale was compelling. This was an opportunity to make systemic change, something that could impact countless children across the state. "I'm honored, Governor," Vanessa said after a moment of reflection. "Let's talk more about this. I'm ready to help make a difference." As Vanessa began preparing for her new role, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent years fighting for individual schools and communities, but now she had the chance to shape policy at the highest levels. It was a daunting task, but Vanessa was ready. As Vanessa and Ethan continued their work in different spheres, the ripple effect of their efforts became more evident. Communities that had once struggled with outdated disciplinary practices were now flourishing under the new restorative models. Children who had once felt alienated were thriving in supportive environments that fostered growth, empathy, and learning. One such community was Lakeside High School, a school that had faced serious issues with suspensions and dropouts. After implementing the changes advocated by Every Child Matters, the school saw a dramatic shift in both behavior and academic success.
Vanessa was invited to visit the school to see the progress for herself.
As she walked through the halls, she was struck by how different the atmosphere felt from the schools she had visited years ago. The students were engaged, teachers were interacting positively with their classes, and there was a sense of mutual respect that permeated the entire building. During her visit, Vanessa met with Mr. Roberts, the principal who had spearheaded the reforms. "Vanessa, I can't thank you enough for what you've done," Mr. Roberts said. "Before we adopted restorative practices, this school was in crisis. But now, we're seeing students who were once on the verge of dropping out become leaders. It's been a complete transformation." Vanessa smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "This is what it's all about," she said. "When we create spaces where kids feel supported, they can achieve incredible things. Thank you for believing in the process." Later, Vanessa sat in on a class where a group of students was leading a peer mediation session, one of the new programs that had been introduced as part of the reform. The students were discussing how to resolve conflicts peacefully, offering suggestions and sharing their own experiences. One student, Jasmine, spoke up. "I used to get in trouble all the time for talking back or getting frustrated," she said. "But now, I feel like people listen to me. I'm learning how to deal with things in a better way, and it's made a huge difference." Vanessa's heart swelled as she listened. Jasmine's story was a testament to the power of restorative justice and the work they had done to create lasting change. As Ethan settled into his teaching career, his passion for education reform only deepened. He saw firsthand the impact that his classroom could have on young minds, and he wanted to extend that influence beyond his own school. He began speaking at local education events, sharing his experiences and encouraging other young teachers to adopt restorative practices in their classrooms. His enthusiasm and relatability made him a popular speaker, and soon he was invited to participate in larger conferences. One day, Ethan was approached by Dr. Miriam Brown, the director of a national teacher training program. "Ethan, I've been following your work, Doctor," Brown said after one of his talks. "Your approach to classroom management is exactly what we need to be teaching new educators. I'd like you to join our program as a guest instructor and help train the next generation of teachers." Ethan was thrilled by the opportunity. "I'd love that," he replied. "If we can get more teachers to embrace these methods, we can change the way education works across the country." As Ethan began working with the training program, he realized just how important it was to pass on what he had learned. He saw young teachers come into the field with fresh ideas, but without the tools to manage their classrooms in a way that fostered connection and growth. Through his work as an instructor, Ethan was able to provide those tools, empowering new teachers to build classrooms that were both structured and compassionate. Years passed, and the work that Vanessa and Ethan had started continued to spread across the country. The success of Every Child Matters had sparked a movement, and more schools were adopting restorative justice, equity-based teaching methods, and mental health support systems. Vanessa's role as an advisor to the governor had expanded her influence even further. She was now working on statewide initiatives that focused on improving access to quality education in underserved communities. Her voice had become one of the most respected in education reform, and she was frequently called upon to consult on national policies. Meanwhile, Ethan's influence within the teaching community continued to grow. He had become a respected voice in education, not just as a teacher, but as a mentor to new educators. His work with teacher training programs had made a tangible difference, and he was widely regarded as one of the most innovative young teachers in the country. One day, as Vanessa and Ethan sat together on the porch of Vanessa's home, reflecting on everything they had achieved, Vanessa smiled softly. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But there's still so much more to do." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but I think we've shown people what's possible. And that's the most important part. Change starts with just one voice." Vanessa looked at her son, seeing the man he had become, the compassionate, driven teacher who had taken up her fight and made it his own. She knew that the future was in good hands. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the horizon, Vanessa and Ethan sat quietly, knowing that their work was far from over, but also knowing that they had already made a lasting difference. And as long as they continued to fight for what was right, the possibilities were endless. The impact of Vanessa and Ethan's work had continued to ripple throughout the education system, and soon their efforts caught the attention of the highest levels of government. Vanessa received a formal invitation to the White House Education Summit, an annual event where policymakers, educators, and advocates gathered to discuss the future of education in America. Vanessa had spoken at countless conferences and events, but the summit represented a new level of recognition. It was an opportunity to directly influence the direction of the nation's education policy, and the invitation was a testament to the power of the movement she had helped build. On the day of the summit, Vanessa arrived at the White House with Ethan by her side. As they walked through the grand halls, she couldn't help but think about how far they had come from fighting against a single school's policies to standing at the epicenter of national education reform. During the summit, Vanessa took her place on a panel with some of the most influential voices in education. The conversation was focused on the future of restorative justice practices in schools, and Vanessa shared the story of Every Child Matters and how it had transformed communities across the country. The truth is, Vanessa said, addressing the audience, education is about more than just teaching subjects. It's about teaching children to believe in themselves. When we support students emotionally and mentally, when we show them that they matter, we give them the tools to succeed not just in school, but in life. Her words were met with applause, and as the panel concluded, several lawmakers and officials approached Vanessa, eager to discuss how they could implement her ideas at a national level. Ethan, standing nearby, couldn't help but beam with pride. His mother had started as a fierce advocate for him, but now she was advocating for children all over the country. She was making history. As Every Child Matters continued to grow, so did the challenges. Some communities were resistant to change, clinging to traditional punitive disciplinary methods. Vanessa found herself increasingly involved in debates with those who believed that tough discipline was the only way to manage classrooms. They argued that removing harsh punishments would lead to chaos, and that students needed to learn the hard way. Vanessa knew these challenges well. She had faced them from the very beginning of her fight for Ethan, and now she was facing them on a larger scale. But she remained steadfast in her belief that restorative justice and empathy were the keys to unlocking a child's potential. One particular challenge arose when a major school district in the South resisted the implementation of restorative practices, despite overwhelming evidence of their effectiveness in other districts. The district's board members argued that their community had different values and that the reforms would undermine authority in the classroom. Vanessa traveled to the district to meet with the board members and teachers, determined to convince them of the benefits of change. She shared stories from schools where students had once been labeled as troublemakers but had flourished under the new system. She brought data that showed how suspensions and dropouts had decreased, while academic performance and engagement had improved. "I understand that change is hard," Vanessa said during the meeting, her voice calm but firm. "But if we want our children to succeed, we need to create environments where they feel supported, not afraid. Discipline should be about guidance, not punishment. It's about helping students see that they are more than their mistakes." The debate was intense, but by the end of the meeting, several board members had softened. One of them, Mr. Jameson, a veteran educator who had initially been skeptical, approached Vanessa afterward. "I'll admit, I wasn't sold on this at first, Mr. Jameson said, his tone thoughtful, "but you've given me a lot to think about. Maybe we've been too focused on controlling kids and not enough on helping them grow." Vanessa smiled. "That's all I ask, that we take a step back and think about what's best for the kids. It's never too late to change." By the end of the year, the district had begun piloting restorative justice programs in several schools. Vanessa knew it would be a long road, but the progress was undeniable. The conversation was changing, and that was the first step toward lasting reform. As Vanessa's influence continued to grow, she found herself in a new role mentoring young advocates who were inspired by her work. Parents, teachers, and students alike sought her guidance, eager to learn how they could bring about change in their own communities. One of those young advocates was Sophie Adams, a passionate college student studying education and social justice. Sophie had been following Vanessa's work since high school and had reached out, asking if she could intern with Every Child Matters. During their first meeting, Sophie was nervous but excited. "I've been following your work for years, Mrs. Parker," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I want to be part of this movement. I want to help change the system for kids like me, kids who felt like they didn't belong." Vanessa smiled, remembering how she had once felt just as nervous and unsure of her own power. "You're already part of the movement, Sophie. By speaking up, you're making a difference." Under Vanessa's mentorship, Sophie quickly grew into a confident advocate. She traveled with Vanessa to meetings, helped organize events, and even began giving talks of her own. Her energy and passion reminded Vanessa of herself when she first started fighting for Ethan, and it was clear that Sophie had a bright future ahead. During one of their last meetings before Sophie graduated, Vanessa gave her a piece of advice that had guided her throughout her own journey. "Never underestimate the power of your voice," Vanessa said. "Even when it feels like no one is listening, keep speaking up. You never know who's hearing your words and how they might be inspired by them." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I won't forget that. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. You've changed my life." Vanessa watched as Sophie went on to launch her own advocacy campaign, focused on reforming education policies in underfunded urban schools. It was a reminder that the fight was being carried forward, not just by Vanessa, but by a new generation of leaders. As Every Child Matters gained international recognition, Vanessa began receiving invitations to speak at global conferences on education reform. Countries around the world were struggling with similar issues: outdated disciplinary practices, unequal access to education, and the need for more inclusive teaching methods. One of the most impactful invitations came from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization UNESCO. They wanted Vanessa to be a keynote speaker at their Global Education Summit, where leaders from over 50 countries would gather to discuss the future of education worldwide. Vanessa felt both honored and overwhelmed. The summit represented the culmination of everything she had worked for, and it was an opportunity to take her message to a global audience. During her speech, Vanessa spoke not just about the changes she had helped bring about in the U.S., but about the universal need for empathy and understanding in education. She emphasized that every child, no matter where they were in the world, deserved to feel valued and supported. "Education is the foundation of our future," Vanessa said, her voice resonating through the large conference hall. "But it's not enough to teach facts and figures. We must teach compassion, resilience, and the belief that every child has something unique to offer. When we create environments that nurture those qualities, we're not just preparing students for school, we're preparing them for life." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and Vanessa left the summit knowing that her work had now reached a global stage. The fight for educational equity and justice was no longer confined to one country, it was a movement that spanned the globe. Years later, Vanessa found herself back where it all began, at Lincoln Elementary, the school where she had first stood up for Ethan and challenged the system that had failed him. The school had been transformed in the years since, becoming a model for restorative justice and inclusive education. The hallways were filled with laughter and energy, and the students walked with a confidence that was once absent. Vanessa had been invited to the school's annual Student Achievement Day, a celebration of the students' academic and personal growth. As she walked through the halls, she passed by a group of students who were part of a peer mentoring program, that had been inspired by Ethan's own work as a mentor years ago. One of the students, Maya, approached Vanessa with a shy smile. "Are you Mrs. Parker? My teacher told us about you. She said you helped make this school what it is today." Vanessa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I guess you could say that. But it wasn't just me. It was a lot of people working together to make things better." Maya's eyes lit up. "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people." Vanessa knelt down to meet Maya's eyes. "You already are helping, just by being kind and standing up for what's right. Keep doing that, and you'll change the world." As the ceremony began, Vanessa took her seat in the audience, watching as the students were called up to receive their awards. When Ethan's name was announced as a special guest speaker, Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't known he would be speaking. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at the young faces in the crowd. He spoke about his own journey, how he had once been a scared little boy, isolated and unsure of himself, but how his mother's fight for him had given him the courage to believe in himself. "My mom taught me that we all have the power to make a difference," Ethan said, his voice steady. "No matter how small we feel, no matter how big the challenges seem, we can create change. We can lift each other up, and that's what I want each of you to remember. You matter, and your voice matters." As Ethan finished his speech, Vanessa felt tears in her eyes. It was a full-circle memento reminder of how far they had come and how much they had accomplished together. The world had changed because of their fight, and the future was brighter than ever. As the ceremony ended and the students filed out, Vanessa and Ethan walked together through the halls of Lincoln Elementary, side by side. They had started this journey together, and they would continue it, forever fighting for the belief that every child, everywhere, deserved a chance to shine. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that. Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.